Tito had been on his own in 1948, and the Russians told the Hungarians to get ready to invade Yugoslavia to keep out the British. And they were all ready to roll into Belgrade when the Americans landed in Korea, right in Stalin's backyard. The British had been telling the U.S. in 1950 that the Russians were making the North Koreans go communist in order to divert U.S. attention away from Tito in the Balkans. And after several years and several thousand dead soldiers in the Korean War, the U.S. figured out that the Russians had nothing to do with the Koreans going communist, and neither had the Chinese, but that the North Koreans had figured out communism all by themselves. And it also hit home with American politicians that the Chinese had just been trying to protect China. A victory parade in Red Square was scheduled for June 24th, 1945. I came to Moscow for the occasion. I wanted to watch our troops marching and to rejoice with all the people in the capital of our homeland. Eisenhower came to Moscow too. He stood with us on the Lenin Mausoleum to review the parade. This was the first time I met Eisenhower. Stalin gave a huge banquet. All our military leaders were there. So was Eisenhower. I don't think Montgomery, the English commander, was there. Stalin had formed good relations with Eisenhower and even better ones with Roosevelt. He had bad relations with Churchill and even worse ones with Montgomery. Khrushchev remembers, page 220. The impetus against going along with the timetable being proposed by the British came suddenly that April of 1943 when FDR demanded an explanation for the British Operation Mincemeat. The body of a British Royal Marine officer had washed up on the coast of Spain with a briefcase shackled to his wrist, and the briefcase contained letters that mentioned military plans written by Mountbatten himself, and the letters described a British landing in Sardinia in vague terms, although the recipient of the letters would have known precisely what he meant, and the briefcase had been immediately sent to Hitler, who responded by moving troops into Greece. The letters said that the Sicily landing was just a diversion, and when FDR read the letters, he thought they were authentic, and FDR did not believe the British claim that the contents of the briefcase were clever and intentional forgeries crafted to deceive the Germans in this mincemeat operation. The British claimed that the reference to a British landing that involved sardines did not mean an invasion of Greece, but really meant Sardinia, but even Hitler figured it out. The washed-up body also had theater tickets in its pocket, and a letter from his bank giving him one last warning to pay his overdrawn account or the bank would take, quote, necessary steps, close quote. And another letter said he was no longer welcome at a club until he paid his dues. And the British told FDR that all these documents had been forged and that they had also faked the picture of his girlfriend, even though she was telling a different story altogether. The British said that mincemeat had been a trick to make the Germans think the British were going to invade Sardinia and not Sicily, and they claimed to have kept several corpses on ice for months in order to jettison a body from a submarine with a briefcase chained to its wrist that was sure to wash up on a certain beach, and then it would immediately be reported and forwarded to Hitler. The British even produced photographs of corpses dressed in British officer uniforms and wearing inflatable life vests, and they said the ocean currents had been carefully mapped so that he would land on the beach in a specific place after floating for days at sea, uneaten by sharks, just to plant these phony letters that would end up on Hitler's desk. The body was found almost to Gibraltar from where it had parted ways with the sub. And from testimony of those who'd been on board the submarine, apparently a gunfight had broken out between the haughty naval officer and the submarine crew after he had ordered them to run a U-boat gauntlet through the Strait of Gibraltar. They'd just been strafed by the Luftwaffe while cruising in Spanish waters, and they'd been at sea for 10 days and were in no mood to argue with him. And when the British naval officer made some smart remarks to the crew, a fight had broken out, and when the body was picked up by a fisherman, it had been in the water for 4 or 5 days, and the Spanish medical examiner determined that he'd still been alive when thrown overboard because water was in his lungs. The British claimed the letters were fake, but Mountbatten had written in one of them that this naval officer with the briefcase chained to his wrist was being sent because he was so trustworthy, and that he was trusted for being, quote, more accurate than most, close quote, about Dieppe, the Dieppe fiasco. And the letter said that he'd been ordered to assist with some plans involving barges and equipment in Scotland. After the body was discovered by the Spanish fishermen on the beach, cables were sent to Berlin with all the details, and the British bombed their own submarine from which he had come, and then set up the Americans to take the blame. The British goaded some American pilots into bombing that submarine by saying that submarines were unstoppable, and the American pilot said, no problem. We can see them underwater on good days and don't need them to come up to periscope depth. And the Americans scored a direct hit in the Bay of Biscay on what they'd been told was a German U-boat, and the British had even given them a picture of the submarine that was needed to be disappeared, but the sub was merely damaged, and many of the crew escaped to tell the tale. Mincemeat had also included the sinking of the Italian cruiser Trieste that had an Italian peace delegation on board, and they'd been intended to meet with the British after the assassination of Hitler on the 13th of March, even though that attempt on Hitler had failed, and at 1:37 p.m. on the 10th of April in 1943, 24 B-17s dropped 6,000-pound bombs each on the Italian Trieste ship from 18,750 feet, which was an accuracy they would not be able to duplicate again, and no anti-aircraft fire had come from the Italians. Italy had joined with Germany to keep the British out of the Italian territory of Libya, and Turkey sided with Germany under the table, and whoever ruled Turkey controlled the lucrative opium trade. Both the Germans and the British weren't after the oil in Romania so much as they were after the opium in the Balkans, because they needed to replace the morphine they had stockpiled for a shorter war, and Hitler's war had been interfering with transports from India. Turkey had stayed neutral while the British were setting up the communists in Yugoslavia, and Churchill secured an agreement at the Tehran Conference in December of 1943 that the Allies would only side with the communist partisans in Yugoslavia rather than the American-friendly Chetniks, and the British were bound and determined to stick to their Balkan plans, even though it meant abandoning the hundreds of American airmen who'd been shot down while bombing the Ploesti oil fields, airmen who were being sheltered and fed by the Chetniks. And this story is not for the faint of heart and can be found in the book The Forgotten 500, the untold story of the men who risked all for the greatest rescue mission of World War II, by Gregory A. Freeman, New York, New American Library, Penguin Group, 2007. Before the war, the British had pulled out of the Pacific to fight in the Mediterranean, and that had left the Americans busy fighting Japan, and the invasion of Greece would begin the launch of Churchill's Balkan invasion to secure Yugoslavia for Britain. And the plan had included turning the Americans into mincemeat in Italy, and 8 years after the war, the British would publish a book about mincemeat called The Man Who Never Was, by Montagu, the same name of the man who had started the Bank of England that had begun the House of Hanover, and the British sealed all the mincemeat files until 2036.